Tennessee football is 2 weeks into its preseason, and we're here to break it down with you today on this edition of the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer, joined by the Knoxville News Sentinel's John Adams and Adam Sparks. Adam, we didn't have you on last week. We want to get to the football stuff soon, but we know your house was among those affected by last week's tornado. Everything going all right out at the Sparks compound?
Yeah, actually, as we record this, I've spent most of my day with tree service guys and insurance and AC unit guys. So I've got them in a sort of a carousel coming through the house. The roofs were torn off of the subdivision beside us, and then they dumped them into our subdivision. So shingles and siding everywhere. They just didn't belong to us. So
well, I have no doubt that Danny White has a GoFundMe fundraiser in the works to help you recoup some of the damages around your house.
Absolutely.
I don't doubt that. And but I know you're back to covering preseason practice, doing a great job with a lot of coverage over at KnoxNews.com. And let's get into some of that because you got some observations we want to unpack here today. Let's save Joe Milton, shall we, and get some clarity on the offensive line competition, because I believe we mentioned on this pod a few weeks ago that figuring out the offensive tackle situations was one of the top storylines, I think, of the preseason. And we've gained some clarity there in the face of Miami transfer John Campbell. Is that right?
Yeah. So, the early on in camp, there was maybe a little bit of a head scratcher that when they came out, John Campbell, he's a left tackle. He was a left tackle at Miami. He started there last year. He was at left tackle, and then Gerald Mincey, the returning starter at left tackle, was his backup at left tackle. Now, Mincey can play right or left. He prefers left, but he can play either. So you think common sense is, well, you put Campbell at left, you move Mincey to right. Now you have your best two tackles in the starting lineup. Instead, Mincey, a returning starter, was a backup, and Jeremiah Crawford was moved over to the right side. If you read between the lines, and I asked Glenn Ellerby, the offensive line coach, about this, I said, are there egos involved in trying to figure out what's going on at offensive tackle? And he said, yeah, that plays into it. But you got to let that play out and wait till you get through the first scrimmage to make, some hard decisions. And so I think there was a little bit of a hint in there about what was going on, because coming out of the first scrimmage last week, we come to the next practice and Mincey is then moved to the right side. So I think again, reading the tea leaves there, I think that was, Gerald Mincey, we're going to give you a couple weeks to show that you can beat this transfer out and keep the left tackle spot. And, then we're going to move you if you don't. And they went through the first scrimmage and he was moved to the right side. And so I give Ellerby some credit in that he had the patience to let that play out. You could have easily just told the returning starter, hey, you're not as good as this other guy, or this other guy can only play that position, so you've got to move. Instead, they let it play out on the field, and they ended up with probably their best two tackles in the starting lineup. And so I think that's not as much of a concern now. The bigger concern is now in the middle of the line, because they have to replace Jerome Carbon at left guard. They haven't had a guy really take that spot. And then Cooper Mays went down with an injury, your preseason All-SEC starting center. And so Ollie Lane, who is the front runner at left guard, he is also the second best center. He has moved to center. So you've got a left guard already playing center. You've got your starting center out, and you've got left guard open where anybody to begin with. So there's some problems there. If Cooper Mays comes back in a couple weeks, which Josh Heupel thinks he probably will, you can put a Band-Aid on that and move forward. But I think it does open up some conversations that could happen later in the year if you have any injuries there, or if left guard isn't good enough.
I think because of Josh Heupel's offensive expertise in his system, offensive line issues aren't as troubling as there might be elsewhere. You just figure he'll find a way to scheme around whatever it needs to be done. But we know there's not going to be, I can't imagine there's going to be a number 10 draft pick like last year when you had Darnell Wright. To me, the center position is really intriguing. Cooper Mays is not a overly big guy for an offensive lineman in the SEC. I know centers aren't as big as offensive tackles or guards either, but he needs to stay healthy. I think a lot is put on a center in this offense. For one thing, he's got to get up there to the ball really fast because Tennessee is going full speed, and he's got to make calls on the fly, blocking assignments, that kind of thing. So that, to me, is a bigger issue. And not that they've downplayed the significance of his surgery, and it's not considered a big deal. But it does raise a red flag. What if he would get hurt? That, to me, a more serious injury, then that could be kind of dicey for Tennessee.
Yeah, what is the level of concern, do you think, Adam, with this injury situation to Cooper Mays? Because you never want injuries to occur. I think, generally speaking, they occur a few weeks before the season starts, and it's like, okay, that's not a 5-alarm fire or anything. But to John's point, the center is a focal point in any offense, but I think in this system in particular, having a center who's the familiar trigger man for Josh Heupel's system at this tempo, particularly with a new starting quarterback. I know Joe Milton's been around for a couple years now, but still, it is a transition to a new starter at quarterback. I think you feel a little better about that if you got your trusted center in the middle of all this.
Yeah, we asked Josh Heupel to specify some type of timetable, and his answer was it's a couple-week deal. So I don't know if he literally means 2 weeks, but that does tell you it's short term, and we've got more than a couple weeks until the season opener. If I had to guess, I would say he would be available for the season opener. Probably able to play the season opener, but you got to think, if let's say Tennessee plays like the line says, which is the betting line, which is like 4 touchdowns or something like that. You can get into that Virginia game, run your offense smoothly with Cooper Mays out there, get up big. He doesn't have to play the full 4 quarters, and then you have a non-conference game the next week, and then you try to get him healed up completely for the trip to Florida. That's one of many scenarios that this could be, but it's not the hardest schedule early in the year. They're not playing a ranked team in the first couple of weeks, so that they can ease this in. Ellerby said that's probably the biggest thing about Cooper Mays is that what John said, which is he makes the calls, he gets them, he makes their offense operate the fastest of any in the country. And Ollie Lane has been there a long time, and he's mostly played guard. He hasn't played much center, but you're going to lose a couple seconds between plays because Cooper Mays is not out there. And if you're losing a couple of seconds between plays, this is no longer the fastest offense in the country, and you could just lose a little bit of an edge. I do think it's also concerning that instead of bringing up the number 2 center, you moved your guard over to center. Because that tells you right there that the backup centers aren't ready. And Addison Nichols, the redshirt freshman, is the guy that they've been trying to get ready. Obviously, he's not there yet. Parker Ball is a longtime backup. He was a walk-on. He's been a possibility. They've got Vason Lang, who's a freshman, who's not going to be ready. They even moved Dane Davis, who is a longtime backup tackle. They've given him some snaps at center. So that tells you that they're not 100% sure what they had there as a backup, that they're having to move guys around. And, we asked Ellerby what was the issue with the backup centers, and he said snapping the ball, which is pretty critical.
Pretty big issue
to that position. And there's also the fact that Ollie Lane was starting at left guard kind of tells you that the other guys that were at left guard weren't working out. Addison Nichols is another one they've tried there. The biggest one is the Texas transfer, Andre Carrick. He's not ready, and now he's probably going to be your starter there right now if Ollie Lane is the starter at center. But just all that goes to say they're not 100% sure of what they have at that interior line, and so what your biggest problems were at tackle have now been moved to the interior. But as I've said on this pod before, Josh Heupel values problem solvers with his assistants, and that's what Glenn Ellerby is. You give him a problem, he'll figure it out, and you can already see that when he's moving pieces now in the middle of camp to make sure that they fill those spots.
when we look at how good Josh Heupel's offense has been, and how he and his staff have done well at recruiting, it's almost as though, well, did they see this coming, this possibility? Is this a sort of, did they not do as good a job as they needed to in recruiting a center? We're talking about how important it is, and yet here we have them having to move a guard over to center, talking about center snap issues. What do you think, Blake? Should this have been resolved in recruiting?
I mean, I think that'll be something for Josh Heupel to address over time. I think everything looked so good for Heupel in Tennessee in the first 2 years. We kind of forgot that if there was an issue with this program, there's probably some depth concerns lying underneath the surface. Now, when you have great star power and you stay largely healthy throughout a season, which by and large Tennessee did last year, I think that can mask some of those issues lying beneath the surface there. But yeah, I mean, I think if there's something that Heupel needs to address over time, and this was sort of the hand he was dealt with the program and flux and some turmoil when he took over, was the depth issue. And that's not something that can totally be addressed overnight, particularly with Tennessee having self-imposed some of those scholarship restrictions kind of coming out of the gates of the Heupel area. So I don't want to be an apologist, but I do think it was a tough hand to play when it comes to building depth.
Yeah, and I think also center is sort of a squirrely position because in high school, your best offensive lineman is not going to be at center. They're going to be usually at a left tackle. If they don't have really good feet, they may be at guard. And just do the math. There's twice as many guards and tackles as there are centers, right? So there's not that many options to go get a 4 or 5 star center. A center in high school is going to be usually undersized. Your smallest, most athletic offensive lineman usually is going to play center. And so that guy's not going to be big enough to play Power 5 football. He's just not. And so that's why you see a lot of guys converted to center. That was the case for Jerome Carvin when he was needed. Cooper Mays, I believe that was the case. Maybe wrong on that. I don't remember Cooper that much in high school. But your best offensive linemen are not going to be at center usually at the high school level. Addison Nichols, they had brought in last year. He was their highest ranked recruit in his class a year and a half ago, and he was a guard tackle. He was not a center. He had never snapped a ball until he got here in spring practice a little over a year ago. And, the fact that it's shotgun, also some guys have issues with that. If you're under center, it's just one motion that you're really just adding to what you do. Shotgun involves a little bit more of a rhythm and a soft touch. And a lot of big bruisers like that do not have a soft touch to snap shotgun. So it's a learned craft. And when you add in that you have to run this offense really, really quickly to operate at that high tempo, it's just sort of an added thing. And I think Addison Nichols is probably going to be your guy long term, but he's not there yet.
All right, well, let's move on to other positions. Quarterback, we didn't figure there was going to be any real quarterback controversy in the preseason. This is Joe Milton's job at the onset, and Nico is in that backup role. There really hasn't even been any faux controversy, which you sometimes see drummed up in the preseason. Even when you kind of know who the starter is, sometimes there will be media reports that suggest otherwise, but that hasn't even happened at Tennessee this preseason. It's been pretty quiet. It's Joe Milton's job. Nico's the quarterback of the future behind him. So as you look at that, though, are there some insights that can be gleaned from what we've seen from quarterback throughout 2 weeks of preseason?
Well, I think as much as anything, it's stuff that's going on off the field. It's the rhetoric around Joe Milton. And this is not his fault, but if you didn't know, if you had parachuted into this program and heard his teammates describe Joe Milton and his coaches describe Joe Milton, you would think this guy has been a 2-year starter, that he was all conference last year, that he's, played 20 games in the system and started 15. And that's sort of what you get, that he's gone and won big games in the SEC. That's not the case. Now, he played fine against Vanderbilt last year, and he played really good against Clemson. I will add the fact that they punted a lot at Clemson. They did not start well. That was not a flawless offensive performance. It was a good performance. It was a clean performance. He threw 3 touchdowns, no picks, no major mistakes. He was the Orange Bowl MVP. That's great. But the rhetoric around Joe is he's been elevated so much this preseason because of his arm strength, because of the Orange Bowl performance, that he is this unquestioned, undisputed leader, that he's a guy that's going to, throw for 3,000 yards or whatever, that he understands the offense inside and out, that, he sort of dictates what things that happen off the field, that all his teammates come to him. They have this immense trust in Joe. All that's good and well. But he started 2 games last year and he was the backup. And so I think Joe Milton's probably going to have a pretty good season. But he's been elevated to such a point now that if he does struggle early in the year, you could be in a tough spot because he's really, really high up there. It would be a long fall to go down if he struggles. I'm not saying lose games. I'm not saying he doesn't play to a certain level, but he could struggle. He could throw a couple picks in a game. He could be off target. The overthrows could return. He just could not have it one day. He's not going to be Hendon Hooker. He's not going to throw 40 touchdowns and 2 picks. Nobody is. And so that's what I've taken out of preseason camp, is that it's sometimes hard to step back and realize this guy is not superhuman. So maybe we need to all take a collective deep breath. I saw odds today again, how his Heisman odds in Vegas are still going way up. And that's crazy. I get it. He's probably going to have some great stats and he's a good player. But boy, we all need to take a deep breath on Joe Milton, because there's nothing that we've seen so far in his career that says he's going to be an all SEC player for 12 games. What we've seen so far is that he has the potential to play to that level in a short period of time.
I've noticed with Josh Heupel's offense, the standards have been set so high, and when it's really rolling, it's so productive. The 66 points against Missouri last year, for example, that any flaw or shortcoming is magnified. On talk shows, even when Hendon Hooker last season, he's a Heisman Trophy candidate, or going back to his first year as a starter when Tennessee averaged almost 40 points a game. Last year, of course, led the nation in average scoring. Fans would, after games, said, well, Hendon Hooker was just okay in that game. They went 2 straight 3-and-outs. I mean, a lot of people have 3-and-outs. I just think the expectations are so high for this offense that fans get a little panicky pretty quickly when Tennessee doesn't just roar down the field and score. And I wonder if that affects the players at all. I wonder, like with Joe Milton, he's talked about how he has had to learn not to be too hard on himself, to forget mistakes. And his offensive coordinator, Joey Halzle, has talked about this. You just learn from your mistake and move on. Easier said. But in this offense, with the production that's anticipated, anything short of that, it generates criticism. It even, like I said, even so with Hendon Hooker, it did, and he was a Heisman Trophy candidate, and maybe Joe Milton will turn out the same way. But I do think he has to be able to handle that anytime the offense doesn't. When he walks off the field after 3-and-out, he can't be bothered by it. Hendon Hooker wasn't.
Adam, do you get any sense for how ready Nico would be if he's needed early in the season? I'm not, again, I want to steer clear of the quarterback controversy thing. I'm not suggesting that, but we've seen the past 2 seasons that injuries can happen. It's not a given you can go wire to wire with one quarterback. Tennessee needed 2 last year. They needed 2 in 2021. They needed more than 2 for much of the Jeremy Pruitt era. How good should Tennessee feel if they were to need Nico for any reason, you think, in the first month of this season?
Well, I'm thinking back to Joe Milton's first start. It was a home game. Was it Bowling Green? Is that who it was? I think Ball State or Bowling Green is one of the B's. Bowling Green, I believe. If you remember back to that game, Milton had some overthrows, and then he had a couple of good throws, and he ended up completing like 50% of his passes. But you could see on a couple plays, you're like, wow, I can see what's there, but this guy is still too far off target. I think that's what you would get out of Nico at this point, maybe throughout any point in this season, because we don't see a lot of practice, but we see enough, and you see him side by side going rep for rep with Joe Milton. And Joe Milton, you see passes on target, 10 in a row. Nico, you will see him on target for a couple, and then you'll see him overthrow a guy by quite a bit. And then you'll see him on target, and then you'll see an overthrow. I said this back in the spring. I never see Nico underthrow a pass. It's always overthrows, whether his mechanics are not perfect or he's just got a cannon for an arm and he's trying to show it or whatever. But he looks like Joe Milton when Joe Milton got here, a couple years ago. That's what Nico looks like to me. Now, could you win some SEC games like that? Could you finish games like that? Yeah, I think you could. He understands the offense pretty well. In the scrimmage that was closed to us, to the media, Josh Heupel hinted at some issues that the backup quarterback, he never says Nico's name, the backup quarterback had in situational football, in 4-minute drills and things like this. He's being tested. Nico's being tested to run the offense efficiently, run it quickly, and run it in situations where he doesn't have time to react. And that's where he's struggling right now. And that's where Joe Milton struggled when he first was the starter. So Nico could do the job to an adequate degree, and there would be plays like that one throw he made to Ethan Davis in the spring game, where he said, "Whoa, look at that!" He was on the run. He was off his back foot and threw an over-the-shoulder pass on the run on a line like 20-something yards downfield. Wow. But then the next one, he's, an overthrow or off target, or he's throwing to the wrong guy. That's what you're going to get out of Nico. You're going to see a really talented yet flawed freshman.
I would think there's a sense of urgency with the coaches about getting Nico ready for that very reason, because then once you go beyond Nico, who knows what Tennessee would have at quarterback. There's just no quality depth beyond Nico. So they have to prepare him, I would think, like he's got to be ready to be the number one quarterback if anything happens to Joe. He's also, if anything happens to Joe Milton, then it's even more imperative that Nico stay healthy. So that's the biggest issue, I think.
Yeah, and by the way, the two topics we've talked about, combine those two. Take Joe Milton out, even for like a half a game or something, turned ankle or something like that. And then Cooper Mays is out right now. Well, suddenly you have, just like that, you're going from a team that's top 10, top 12 in the country to having a freshman who's never played a snap as your only scholarship quarterback. You've got a center that's out. You've got a guard who has not started before regularly moving to center. And then you've got a brand new guard who's never started. And so the dominoes can fall in a good way. The dominoes can also fall in a bad way with just a couple of issues. And I think that interior line and quarterback are two of those where that could be pretty pivotal.
Let's flip over to the other side of the ball. We've talked about the offense up to this point. We know elevating that defense is going to be paramount to Tennessee kind of living up to its goals this season, particularly because you don't have Hendon Hooker anymore. The defense is going to have to at least hold its own. I'm curious about a couple things in particular and what you've seen there. Number one, we've talked a lot about Keenan Peely, the BYU transfer linebacker, throughout this offseason. How does he look in the middle of that defense, number one? And number two, the back end of the defense was really the softest point last year. That defensive secondary, it really cost Tennessee at times. It certainly cost Tennessee in the loss to South Carolina. So what have we seen from Peely and also from the back end of the defense here?
Peely is middle linebacker. They've moved Aaron Beasley to the wheel, to the weak side linebacker. I'm not even going to attempt to explain Tennessee's scheme, but they only play two linebackers. There's one in the middle, one on the weak side. The past 2 years, Jeremy Banks had played on the weak side. So the plays that people remember of Jeremy Banks being this guided missile and taking out quarterbacks and running backs and just running all over the field. That's now the position that Aaron Beasley is playing. And by the way, that's the position he played in the Orange Bowl when he had the best game of his career, like 2 sacks and 4 TFLs. So that position is a guy that's supposed to just go make plays. Peely is a more traditional middle linebacker. Now, I said that to Brian Jean-Marie, the linebackers coach at UT. I called Keenan Peely a traditional middle linebacker, and he bristled at that and said, no. He's because the takeaway there is, well, that he's big and slow, and he's a guy that can only play the run. They say he can rush the passer. He can drop into coverage. He's agile. He may be. I want to see it on Saturdays because, BYU has produced a lot of good linebackers over the years. There's a different animal of a BYU very good linebacker and an SEC linebacker. You've got to be a little more athletic. He has the size and all that, and his teammates say he meets you in the hole. You feel it. But I want to see him drop into coverage, and that goes to Blake, your second question about the secondary, because there's multiple issues in this pass defense, and it was close to the worst in college football last year. There's the pass rush. They've got to figure out how to get a pass rush with Byron Young gone. There's the secondary, obviously, is the biggest piece of that. But then there's the linebackers, and they're a big piece of the coverage. And so Peely is going to have to cover people, or else he's not going to be on the field. And in the secondary, I mean, I think I want to ask this of you guys, because sometimes I feel like I've been too close to this over time. But I was adding up in the secondary of all the guys they have coming back. I was adding up the games they'd played and the starts that all these guys got back, because if I list off the DBs that Tennessee has coming back, fans will instantly recognize their names because they're the same guys as last year. Now, Gabe Judy Lawley is the new guy. He's the BYU transfer. He's played at Vanderbilt. But everybody else is pretty much back. They have, if you add it up, which I did, Tennessee's returning defensive backs have 335 games played at the FBS level. They combined have 133 starts, and that's 10 different guys that split up those 133 starts. In other words, on average, 10 guys that have started for an entire season are now in the secondary. So, I mean, I ask you guys, I don't even know what my takeaway is there if they struggle this year. Does that mean if they're bad in the secondary this year, that means these players are just not good? Or does that mean this coaching staff can't coach them? Because they've been here forever and they've played a ton of games and it hasn't worked out yet. So if it doesn't work out this year with the same players, what does that mean?
To me, it means that they're a hot pocket, and hot pockets don't change much from day to day, right? If you eat a hot pocket for lunch every day, you know what you're getting, but you're not dressing up a hot pocket. You're getting a hot pocket, and it's going to be the same thing every day. So even if you eat that hot pocket 5 days a week, you know what you're getting. It's familiar. You're never going to say, "Ooh, lunch was awful today," because it was the same as it was the day before. But lunch is never going to be very good either. It's just always going to be the same, and it has a ceiling on it because it's a stinking hot pocket for Pete's sake, right? Like that's what my interpretation is here, which I think is not just a Tennessee thing. Like when you have a position group that's had a ceiling on it for a few years, and you want to get a little higher production out of it. And you see in these preview magazines, all this experience returning, the number of starts returning. And you go back, it's like, was that a good thing? Because they were kind of a bugaboo last year. They were the position group that, could cost you at times. So that, to me, is what it is. It's a hot pocket for lunch every day. You know what you're getting. It's not going to be great, but you know what it is.
If you switch from ham and cheese hot pocket to the chicken, broccoli, and cheddar, and you go back and forth, it tastes like a different meal.
There you go.
Speaking from experience.
I think that's an amazing stat. 10 different defensive backs have combined for 133 starts. When I look at those 10 guys, what's also, to me, unusual about that is that none of them really stick out to me. They're just kind of all in this same group. And if I said, well, who would be the most likely out of these 10 guys to become an all-SEC player? I have no idea whom I would pick. Usually you'd think there's some guy that shows flashes, makes some plays. You think, yeah, he could be the guy. I just don't see that with this bunch. And I think that's the biggest concern about this Tennessee team is, what if these guys are no better than last season? Tennessee's going to give up a lot of passing yards.
And I'm curious to see how much flexibility this coaching staff shows, because I think it's a fair criticism. In the past, they have not replaced guys. They haven't moved guys around enough. They've said, well, it's, we won the game. Yeah, we gave up a ton of yards, but we still won the game, and we made a couple plays on third down late in the game, and that's fine. And their defense had some really good strengths last year, but it was more in the front seven. It was the run defense. It was pass rush. It was not in the secondary. And I think sometimes this coaching staff said it's good enough. We're not going to mess with it because it could be worse. We could have a young guy out there and just blow coverages rather than, giving up a moderate amount of yards. So this year they've got a chance to sort of reboot that and rethink that. And I see at least hints that they may go a different path. Warren Burrell, who missed most of last year, he was the starter at corner with the last couple of years, but he started the first 2 games last year and then had an injury, was out all of last year. He's back now, as a lot of guys are. He's back at corner, but they've had some minor injuries at safety and star position, which is their nickel back. They've moved Burrell from corner to the star position in safety. So he's sort of cross-training at those other positions. That tells me maybe they're thinking, maybe he wasn't good enough. Maybe we need to try him somewhere else. Andre Turrentine he's an Ohio State transfer, came here a year ago. He's a Nashville kid from Innsworth. They've had him starting at safety so far, and he didn't play that much last year. There's just hints, I think, of them saying, we're not going to completely scrap this group and start over or just play freshmen, but we're going to try to give it a different look. If you think last year, Danico Slaughter was a star and a safety, and in a pinch, they had to put him at corner because they were running out of corners because of injuries. They put him at corner, and he was their best corner in no time. And so I think there's a thought of, maybe we should do that with other guys and see how they work out in different places. And they pride themselves on having defensive backs that have a lot of versatility, but I don't think they practice that as much in games, and they haven't been as flexible on their own. So I'll be curious to see if they take these same ingredients and try to do something different with it. Not a hot pocket, but maybe some of the dish.
Well, I want to wrap up here shortly, but before we do, there's a name I keep hearing throughout the preseason, and I know, Adam, you're out there as much as anyone, so we can get your reaction to this. Dont'e Thornton, the Oregon transfer. Boy, there is a lot of buzz building around him, the wide receiver. Now, I know the easy thing to do would be to say, hey, just look at the Orange Bowl. The 3 wide receivers Tennessee played in that game, that they leaned on anyway, played more than 3, but the big 3, if you will, they're all back. Brew McCoy, Squirrel White, Ramel Keaton. Why not just roll out those 3? Well, Thornton, you just, at least from kind of the periphery, you keep hearing his name come up. So what's your read on that, Adam? Is that just buzz around a transfer that tends to happen? Those guys sometimes get the spotlight more so than the returners, or is there something legitimate there where this guy could become a major factor in this offense?
I was talking to somebody at practice the other day, somebody in the UT athletic department, and we were watching receiving drills. And this person leaned over to me and said, I saw a headline or some report the other day, is Dont'e Thornton a Biletnikoff candidate? And at that point, the guy said, we need to slow this train down. This is getting out of hand. And this is as a fan of Dont'e Thornton. We were actually talking about, hey, this guy looks good. He's got all the tools, but I would agree with that guy. Need to slow the train down. He's not starting right now. Those other 3 guys you mentioned were the starters in the Orange Bowl. If they played today, they would be the starters today. Now, Josh Heupel, as he has said for the last couple of years, he says they're going to expand the rotation. It's not just going to be 3 guys. And we've heard that so many times. It's not going to be just 3 guys. Now, it's easy to say that early in the season because Virginia, they're probably going to get a big lead. They're going to get early games, and so you're going to have other guys playing. So Dont'e Thornton could be the number 4 receiver, not get in the first quarter and a half and still finish the game with 100 yards in some of these games. But in SEC games, is he in the rotation? Let's wait and see. As I've said on this pod before, the last 2 seasons, the 3 guys you started the season with at wide receiver were not the 3 that played most of the snaps throughout the year. You always had one guy get injured or get replaced, and so it changes. I think all 4 guys are going to play a lot this year and catch a lot of balls, but Dont'e Thornton's not that yet. He's a typical preseason hype guy in that he's 6'5", so he looks the part. He can fly. He's really fast, so he looks the part. He didn't start at Oregon last year, so there was something that Oregon looked at and said, we can use him. He had caught like 20 balls, had a couple touchdowns. Something that Oregon told them, we can use him. He's got a place in their offense, but he's not good enough to start yet. And I think they saw the tools there, but it didn't work out completely. So that tells you maybe there's a little bit missing in his game now. He's got plenty of time to show that. I suspect some of it is that he has the size to play on the outside, but not necessarily the strength. You saw that a little bit with Jalen Hyatt 2 years ago, where he was on the outside but did not have the strength to get off press man coverage, so they had to move him to the slot. Because he's a big guy, Thornton, he's athletic for his size, but he doesn't get out of breaks as well as like a Squirrel White would or a smaller typical slot receiver. So you have to be a little bit creative with him, not in the same way that they were with Hyatt, but you have to be creative. And so I can see some things that a defense would look at and say, we can exploit this one little weakness. But overall, he's got the tools, he's got the speed, he catches balls. If you went out and saw him at practice, you would say that's an NFL wide receiver. I'll just be curious to see where he fits in the offense. I think it'll take a few games before they can figure that out.
Well, I think that experience matters in this offense. And I think those 3 returning guys, it would be hard for anybody to displace them because they all looked really good at the end of last season. So Brew McCoy, 52 catches, Squirrel White, fast and quick. I see him being an all-SEC receiver. And Ramel Keaton has proven to be a big play guy, and he makes tough catches. So I think it's a real nice group, and I think they'll find a way to use Dont'e Thornton too, but probably won't win the Biletnikoff Award. You're right about that, Adam.
Yeah, you didn't hear that from us. We'll
No.
put the brakes on that just a little bit. But preseason practice rolls on. You can find all the coverage from Adam at KnoxNews.com. John will have the commentary throughout the next couple weeks here, leading up to that September 2nd opener against Virginia in Nashville. And we will continue to be here with you. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.